Good evening. Welcome to In Focus. Tonight, two stories show how power is being exercised on very different fronts through force on the ground and leverage at the negotiating table. In northwest Nigeria, President Donald Trump says U.S. forces struck Daesh targets in coordination with Abuja, raising questions about what success looks like and how the threat is defined. And in the Ukrainian war, a Russia report suggests President Vladimir Putin could consider a limited territory swap while insisting Russia must take all of the Donbas, with the future of Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant emerging as a key bargaining chip. Two theaters, one theme, escalation and negotiation moving side by side. I'm Mona Moselhi, and this is In Focus, where we cut through the noise and stay with what really shifts the story. U.S. President Donald Trump says American forces launched Christmas Day strikes on Daesh targets in northwest Nigeria in coordination with Nigerian authorities. Nigeria's Foreign Ministry confirmed the operations as part of joint security cooperation. U.S. Africa Command says the strikes hit Daesh camps in Sokoto state, with an initial assessment indicating multiple fighters were killed. Trump framed the operation as a response to extremist violence. He says he targeted Christians, but Nigerian officials and analysts argue the insecurity is driven by overlapping insurgency and criminal networks that affect communities across religious lines. That tension matters because it shapes what comes next, how Abuja and Washington define the threat, how they justify the response, and whether further joint action reduces the threat or risks inflaming divisions in a fragile security environment. Now, the U.S. strike in northwest Nigeria matters as much for what it signaled as for what it destroyed. This is a highly political operation, not only because it happened on Christmas Day, but because it touched a long-standing question in Washington's African policy: when does a local security crisis become a transnational counter-terror priority? The location, Sokoto State, is also telling. It is not one of the most internationally known Nigeria flash points, yet it sits in a wider northwest belt where insecurity has surged through a mix of armed groups, trafficking routes, and militant cells that can move across difficult terrain and exploit gaps in state control. To unpack this issue, we are joined from Washington by managing partner at Total Impact Capital and former U.S. Ambassador to the African Union, Ambassador John Seaman. Good evening to you, sir, and welcome to Qnews and welcome to In Focus. Let me start here from a strategic standpoint. What does a U.S. Christmas Day strike on Daesh targets in northwest Nigeria signal? Is this a one-off punitive action or the start of a more sustained counter-terror posture in West Africa?
Well, thank you for having me. And I would hope that any sort of military action will be part of a comprehensive strategic approach in partnership with local authorities that would make serious headway against one of the more insecure regions in the world, which is northern Nigeria. Unfortunately, I fear that this is just a one-time kinetic action designed to make headlines, but not necessarily to truly make a difference on the ground, and that's the concern I have. We'll see in the fullness of time which result will actually occur, but like I said, at this point we don't see that this is part of a comprehensive approach that would include not only military action but also support for local security forces and support for basic human needs for the people in that area to help reduce the reason why people would join organizations affiliated with Daesh.
Right, but then Nigeria's government and many analysts warn against framing the violence primarily as religious persecution. Now, how should Washington describe the threat in a way that is accurate, that avoids inflaming sectarian tension and still builds domestic support for action?
Well, I think the Nigerian government is absolutely right in that regard. I mean, the extremist groups in northern Nigeria, and there's several of them, inflict much more pain on Muslim populations than they do on Christian populations in terms of kidnappings and killings and other types of violence in the area. So this is not a Christian-Muslim issue. This is an issue between the broader population in the area and Nigeria itself, and a set of extremists who take advantage of difficult to police, difficult to control lawless areas in northern Nigeria to operate.
Mm-hmm. What, from your point of view, are the key success metrics for a strike like that, beyond definitely the reported casualties in terms of degrading networks, disrupting financing, reducing recruitment, or even improving civilian security?
So your question sort of embeds the answer in it. The strike itself cannot really be successful unless it is complemented by other activities to increase security in the region, increase the livelihoods and the well-being of the people there, and discourage people from supporting or joining these extremist organizations. And that requires not a one-time kinetic action, but a long-term approach that is difficult to implement in this area of the world. So it requires working not just with the federal authorities, but with the state authorities and with the local the local communities and the tribes in the area. It requires, like I say, economic development activity on top of military activity to give the communities a stake in a more stabilized, more peaceful area. And it requires capacity building for local law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Now, coordination. And that word was said in describing the matter of a coordination that took place between Washington and Nigerian authorities. In practical terms, what does coordination usually mean in these operations, and what guardrails matter most to protect sovereignty, limit civilian harm, and prevent mission creep?
So first and foremost, if we're, as the United States, going to attack an extremist group in a country, it would be best, although obviously this is not always the case, certainly this was not the case in Syria in recent years, it would be best if we do that in concert with local authorities. And so in this particular case, the Nigerian government helped us identify the targets, and based theoretically on intelligence that they had about where these extremist groups were operating, we were hopefully able to inflict serious damage. Whether we were or not is something that's still to be seen. But so if we want to reinforce the sovereignty of the countries with which we're working with, mm-hmm. we should be operating in concert with them and be guided by their knowledge on the ground. But that's, as again your question points out, just the beginning. It also means that we need to be thinking of this in the context of a long-term strategic partnership, not just as a one-off activity.
Mm-hmm. Now, looking across the African Union and the regional blocs, What kind of political and operational backing would make counter-Daesh efforts more effective, and where do you see the biggest gaps today?
So,
Intelligence sharing, border control, governance, developments, what?
well, that's a long list, and they're major gaps. I guess the biggest gap that I would see, and this applies in West Africa, is that the West African countries, there are a number of them that have been where democratic governments have been overthrown by military juntas, and those military juntas have not been acting in concert with the democratic governments in the region. So one of the major challenges, if you look across Africa, is getting, these extremist groups don't really recognize borders. They cross borders all the time. And so you need a regional approach. And, a few years ago, the Economic Community of West Africa, ECOWAS, had organized a regional approach against one of the extremist groups, Boko Haram, and had some success in that. But unfortunately, that regional approach is broken down as some of those governments have been overthrown. And so the way the African Union works is it devolves power to the various regional economic communities, and those economic communities ideally have, coordinate their military and security operations to really take the fight to these organizations. When that's happening effectively, I think you see a fair bit of success. But when these regional groups can't operate in concert, and when there's disputes between the various members, then I think you see serious gaps. And I think that's unfortunately what's happening in West Africa today.
And that's another point. From an economic and investment and development lens, how do security shocks such as that affect capital flows and risk pricing in West Africa? And what targeted economic moves, jobs, infrastructure, community? I mean, how does that reflect on the country itself?
So security is probably the greatest risk any investor looks at when they look at investing in a country. If they don't have confidence that there's going to be some sort of stability, it's going to be very difficult for them to commit resources into that area. And that's part of the reason why this part of Nigeria, northern Nigeria, is one of the more undeveloped regions in the world, even though Nigeria itself has significant resources from oil and other aspects of its economy. So where there's a lack of security, it is very difficult to drive the type of investment that will lead rise to significant economic development. And that's why dealing with the security issue is so important, but why it's important to deal with it in the long term, not just on a one-off basis.
Right. From Washington, that was the managing partner at Total Impact Capital and former U.S. ambassador to the African Union, Ambassador John Seaman. We thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your insights and for joining us. And back to our next segment, and a Russian newspaper reports President Vladimir Putin may be open to a limited territory swap in Ukraine, but insists Russia must get the whole of Donbass as U.S.-backed talks continue. Kommersant says Putin raised the idea in a late-night Kremlin meeting with top businessmen, signaling that outside Donbass a partial exchange is possible while maintaining that Donbass must be fully under Russian control. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky says Kiev and Washington are edging toward a 20-point plan, but still disagree on any demand to cede remaining Ukrainian-held parts of Donbass and on the future of the Russia-held Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. The report also says Putin discussed possible joint U.S.-Russian management of the plant, underscoring that territory and critical infrastructure are now central bargaining chips. For more analysis into this situation, we are joined from Sevastopol by Dr. Ammar Qana, a professor of international relations at Sevastopol Russian University. Good evening to you, sir, and welcome to In Focus. Let me start by asking you if Moscow floats a partial swap but draws a red line on all of Donbas. Is that a real opening or a way to lock in rather maximum terms early?
Greetings to everyone. When we talk about lands or territories, there is a lot of controversy and gray area and misconceptions. I think this concept was used first since the Alaska summit, and it was based on a swap of the partially controlled Ukrainian land, the Kursk region, and the other regions such as Donbass and Zaporozhye. But talking today about the different findings that we have when it comes to giving lands to Russia, there are foundations that we cannot talk about, which is Donbass, Zaporozhye, Zonzun, and the Crimean. But I think there will be some kind of flexibility that takes Russia out of the newly controlled areas under the concept of a buffer zone, which is Sumy, Kharkov, and Dnipropetrovsk, and also Nikolaev. Here we can talk about these regions, but when it comes to Zelensky's proposals, they do not even come close to the reality or the political reason, especially with what we're seeing of the Russians advancing on all fronts.
Right. What does a territory swap look? I mean, here in practice, what verifications then would be needed to make it durable?
This question is all about the talks between both parties, Moscow and Washington. We hear a lot of contradicting statements by Zelensky and his disapproval, and also his supporters from the European Union of this argument. When they talked first about a new map, there was a lot of obstacles, and Europe, especially Western Europe, with Germany, Britain, are trying to extend this crisis and buy more time, using the lands to gain more time and to buy more time, depending on the elections in the US Congress, as they may find new pressuring tools on Trump to change his stance towards this crisis and towards Russia especially.
Right, but up till this minute we did not exactly see how a territory swap would be. Now Zelensky says the gap remains on Donbas and the Zaporozhye plant. Which issue is more likely to break the talks first, and why from your point of view?
In my opinion, any holdback will come from the Ukrainian disapproval, as they demand a lot. They request a lot of demands, especially such as a referendum, a popular referendum on this issue, the territory swap. But we cannot miss that we are seeing a geopolitical crisis, and Ukraine is the playground, and it has been employed by the Western system. When it comes to priorities of Russia, it is very clear. We have some regions that has already joined the Russian Federation, and they were not any negotiation tools to begin with. But when it comes Roska and with Sumi, we can talk about these in the upcoming period.
Then, from your point of view also, how could the Zaporizhzhia plant, a nuclear plant, become a part of a deal without creating a long-term security and sovereignty trap for either sides?
When it comes to this nuclear plant, it is located in the Zaporozhye province, and they were part of the US-Ukrainian negotiation to operate this plant and to give it for operational, which is the largest in the region, to provide the nuclear fuel to the entire European continent. I think it will be under the Russian control, and its production of electricity can be put in economic political equation between Russia and the United States, and Ukraine can be a small part of this equation. But when it comes to its location and its ownership, it is directly related to the geography, which is under the Russian constitution after the referendum in Zaporozhye and Vixona, in addition to other regions.
So you're pinpointing your finger on one thing that could destruct the whole negotiation. Let me here go to Putin's even older conditions that included Ukraine renouncing NATO aim. Is that still the hardest political barrier, or is land now the main one?
One of the basic principles, not even the terms. This was when the military operation started. Still, Ukraine joining the NATO is impossible, and it's impossible for Russia to accept, or even for any NATO forces to exist on Ukrainian lands, is an unacceptable matter for Russia. We have a lot of statements leading to this same directions, such as the Trump statements that the United States officially does not accept the Ukrainian membership in the NATO. Also, the Hungary, Slovakia are rejecting the same premise. And this is an excuse now being employed by Zelensky to extend the crisis further, because his political career basically depends on it. And before the European and before the West, he's already expired, even with his consultants and the ministers in his government. Now he's only trying to play with all of these tools to buy more time and not to reach a political solution soon.
Now, so what would count as a partial deal that is credible and hopefully durable? And what would be a warning sign that talks are being used only to buy time for more fighting?
This is completely related to the difficult situation where the Europeans are going through right now. Zelensky cannot head to the negotiation table at the moment, and this crossroads is increasing, is getting more complicated, and it's adding more choices for certain parties. They are talking about the concept of peace, just peace for Ukraine, leading to defeating Russia strategically. They are talking also about these plans as if we're talking in 2022 and not at the end of 2025. Of course, it's some kind of a political schizophrenia. They are detached from the reality and what is happening on the ground, the economy of Europe, the economy of Ukraine.
Exactly. Europe from one side, the
نعم
United
أوروبا
States on the other hand, and that has already made some or put alliances at odds. This is from one side. From your point of view, how do you view the foreseen relations of Europe with the United States and the response towards this should be 20 points negotiating plan from the United States?
Today, we are seeing a lot of tensions and divisions between Europe and the United States at two levels. First of all, the economy, which was started by the United States by imposing the customs tariffs imposed by Trump on the European Union. Second is the security equation. We can see that the US security view for the European Union, which is started by Trump since he took office in his first term, increasing the spending in the NATO, reaching 45% of the GDP. These are disastrous figures for many of the NATO members. And today, the European system is in a real predicament as they are losing the geopolitical influence and power, and therefore they are not able to impact the US decision. And the Western Europe and the United States has always been part of the Western um, system, and this is changing right now. So we see this US initiative to end or eliminate the conflict not stemming from any bias to Russia, but to maintain the higher national interests of the United States and the new world that is being formed and coined without the multilateralism in mind.
Dr. Ammar, if I may ask you here, do you think the two parties negotiating or the two parties that are really inside this war, Russia and Ukraine, do you really think that those upcoming or those negotiations would really be an end to this war? Would that be the intentions from the Russian side and the Ukrainian one? Are we expecting any development that would really put all those negotiations to a stop?
So far, there are no direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. All of what we have seen is the US path for negotiations, starting from Geneva, going to Berlin, and then back to Miami. And the Russians are convening in Miami with the United States. So the US initiative is being formulated and taking into consideration the demands of Ukraine and Europe to be offered and presented to the Russian party without real consensus. There must be a political solution, but this requires a lot of compromises that can be painful for both parties, Europe and Ukraine. But so far, providing any compromises has not matured in Ukraine or for the European Union even. That's why we see that further direct escalation at a military level and inside Europe when it comes to the inevitability of the military conflict between Russia and the European states. And that's why I think that Washington in the advanced stages can pressure Europe and pressure Ukraine to start the political path forward, through which we can partially reach to a security equation that is suitable for the European region.
Very much indeed, and very hopeful from the whole word from Sevastopol. That was Dr. Ammar Qanaa, a professor of international relations at the Sevastopol Russian University. So we thank you so much for your insights and for joining us here tonight. And tonight's two stories underline the same reality. Power is being tested in the field and at the table. In Nigeria, a strike may disrupt Daesh networks, but it also raises harder questions about definitions, consequences, and what stability actually requires. In Ukraine, talk of territory and a nuclear plant shows how a potential deal is being shaped by leverage, not just language. The challenge now is whether these moves reduce risk or simply reset the terms for the next phase of the conflict. I'm Mana Mosalhi. Many thanks for watching In Focus, or this episode of In Focus. Stay tuned for more updates and analysis on Qnews.